And one of the things that we did during that Russia visit was we visited a few churches. And the churches were filled with icons. And I grew up in a tradition that didn't give any attention to that at all. So I was like, what is this all about? And it captured my imagination such that I did some of my own study and some of my own reading. And so now we have an expert that's coming to chat about this and show us some pictures about some things, and I'm very excited about it. It reminds me of the time that I was in Amsterdam, and I thought, well, I should probably try to get a little culture, and so I went to the Rembrandt Museum, and I thought, I'll just walk around. I'll probably recognize a bunch of these things anyway. And I realized I had no idea what I was looking at until I caught up with a tour, and I just kind of latched onto the tour, and all of a sudden these paintings came to life by listening to seeing and understanding what I wasn't seeing. So I'm looking forward to having you bring to life some of these wonderful icons and the stories that they tell. So will you join with me as we celebrate Dr. Jennifer Oz Freeman, who's Associate Professor at United Seminary, as she comes and shares with us today. Welcome.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to be with you in worship this morning. I bring greetings from Holy Trinity Orthodox Church in St. Paul, on the east side of St. Paul, where I'm a parishioner, and also from United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, where, as you said, I'm a professor. I also direct the Theology and Arts program, and my own academic specialty is early medieval art. So what I mean by that is especially 8th and 9th century in Western Europe, and I'm interested also in my research in the relationship between East and West, and we'll see a little bit about that this morning. But I teach quite broadly across time. So I also teach at the University of Minnesota, where I'll teach a medieval art survey. I'm also a practicing artist. I have a background in technical theater and have done some illustrating of children's books and things like that along the way, so a bit of a dabbler, we'll say. What I'd like to share with you this morning is an introduction, I suppose, to Christian icons and their use in Eastern Christianity. And some of the themes that we'll be looking at is basically the origins of icons. How did we come to have them in the way that we have them today? What is the role of the icon in Christian worship? Obviously, in many Protestant traditions, there are no images in worship. And there's a historical tradition and reason for that, stemming from the Protestant Reformation in Europe, where you have some strains of Protestant traditions that totally rejected images. You have others like Luther, who very strategically used images in his Reformation efforts, where print medium was really significant for his work. And part of this really for me has to do with affirming the goodness of creation and materiality. And I'll say more about that. But let's first start with what an icon is. And you have some. If you haven't had a chance to peek at those, if you've come in, we can pass them around further. These are some icons from my own personal collection at home, and I can say more about them. But maybe as you've been looking at them, and I'll put some up here on the screen, just a couple of samples. I wasn't sure, how big the screen would be, so didn't want to flood it too much, but this gives you a sense. This is only a very, very small selection of the types of iconography and compositions that one might find in icons. But I'd like to invite from you, so some of you have seen icons in other places, or maybe in a museum in which they're completely removed from their liturgical context. But I wonder if you'd be willing to share some of what your own knowledge or experiences of icons, or what questions you have, or what even if you've never thought about icons before, which is perfectly fine, what you've noticed in the icons that have been passed around and that you see behind me, if there's some kind of similarities or noticings that you have about those.
Well, I've seen them a lot, and they're kind of weird. And without knowing what the artist is trying to to say in that.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're trying to say something.
Right.
But not knowing that, they're just kind of there.
Yeah, they're kind of weird.
Kind of a bad picture.
Yes, exactly.
Not
Yeah.
that we have strong opinions.
No. Well, so I'd say to that, that's right. It's a good, they're kind of weird looking. And they certainly come, from here in America. They're coming from a different culture. So they're coming usually from Eastern Europe, from Greece, from the Middle East, North Africa, and Ethiopia has incredible icons. But it's true, and I have a similar, when students take my medieval art classes, they sometimes at first laugh at some of the images that I show them from the Middle Ages because they look weird. They're not these like Renaissance ideal kind of naturalistic images. And so then the question we have to pose is, sometimes there's just bad art and maybe artists aren't technically very good. But I think the first question needs to be, why did the artist make these choices? First, we should give the artist the benefit of the doubt and assume that they made choices in the creation of this work. When we have a long tradition like this, it's clear these are choices that are being made. They're choosing for thousands of years to represent these figures in this way. So then we wonder, why is that, right? Yeah, do you have an answer?
Yes.
Okay, we'll come back over here.
Having spent 23 years traveling back and forth to Bulgaria, total of
yes.
76 trips to Bulgaria. In the Bulgarian Orthodox faith, icons are ever present. I heard Protestant church ministers saying, oh, they're worshiping icons.
Right.
But I got to know some people who are Orthodox Christians. And I said, what is it about icons? And they said, each one of them represents a part of the faith. And in kissing an icon, we are showing reverence to that, what that icon is representing.
Yep.
And there's a deep reverence in the Bulgarian psyche around icons. And I've got a couple of favorite ones. And I've got one that I have on my wall of my office. And it's interesting. When I'm feeling good about my relationship with the Lord, that icon is smiling at me. But when I'm not feeling so good, he's frowning at me. I've also met some of the artists who have, I met one man who does iconography, and he said it's stylistic. There are certain things that they have in these pictures that are traditional, and it's a rich, rich, rich tradition that if you have not experienced it, it's very difficult to understand.
Yeah, it takes time. So, do you have an answer too?
He does.
Oh, great.
An answer, it's a comment.
Sure.
We traveled, a lot in Europe, but in Russia especially, and the Orthodox churches were obviously where we saw lots of icons, and it's an art form, I think, and we liked the art enough that we brought home icons, and we have a wall, only has 3 on there, but we didn't start a collection.
Yeah.
But in our bathroom we have one, and that's of Saint Barbara. So she knows which side of the sink, which sink is hers. But it was, but you wouldn't, if you didn't appreciate what is represented, and we'll let you tell us about it, we wouldn't have brought these home. I mean,
Yeah.
they were a thing of beauty.
Yeah.
And we struggled to find, walls as we moved. But anyway,
Yeah. Oh, that's
thank
great.
you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think already in these 2 comments that there's a kind of resonance or attraction impact to them, and also the acknowledgement that they can be, depending on your background, a kind of foreign kind of image, and so it might take some time to get to know them, the way you might get to know your neighbor. But to the question of what the artists are trying to do, they're not attempting to represent, and in fact they resist representing the illusion of three-dimensional space. They're not trying to do what Renaissance artists are trying to do quite intentionally. And in fact, sometimes you'll find that the buildings look quite distorted. And it's often the case, or it's talked about, that rather than a vanishing point, again, thinking of, not to pick on the Renaissance again, but a vanishing point that recedes into space, right, creates the illusion of space. In Orthodox icons, frequently that's reversed, and so that you, the viewer, are the kind of focal point that things are coming towards, right? So there's, even in the design of the image, an implied relationship between the viewer and the image. What other things you pointed to, that the image is sometimes smiling or frowning at you, depending, so that even in that something that's it seems to be static, there is a kind of dynamic nature. You'll notice that icons don't show strong emotions. They're not theatrical. There are images, of course, where, say, of the crucifixion or certain motifs of Mary, where mourning or sadness are being shown. But there's not going to be something like you see in the Baroque period, where it's very theatrical and there's dramatic lighting and those kinds of things. Because again, it's not the purpose of the image. The purpose of the image is to invite contemplation and prayer. You can come to an image with your emotions, certainly, but that's not what the image is bringing to us. Likewise, the figures in these images aren't talking. Their mouths are closed, you know. These are silent images, in other words, but that's not to say that they're empty images. It's a kind of profound silence. I could say more about kind of apophatic mystical theology there, but I'm gonna bracket that, because once I start talking about that, I go off, so, you know, some other time maybe. Okay, anything else that anyone would want to remark on and what they notice in these images before we continue? I have to keep an eye on my time, actually. Maybe I'll move along, yeah. Okay, I want to, so yeah, I think we kind of hit a lot of good things there. There are texts, labels. You'll find Mary on the icon on this front table. It's Stephen the proto-martyr. And so the name or the title of the person, and sometimes, especially for Mary and Jesus, those will be abbreviated in various ways. Because I'm taking these from my own collection, have just brought in paintings, but icons don't have to be paintings. They can be out of any material, mosaics, textiles. And my next slide will talk a little bit about terminology. These are also small, because I could fit them in my book bag, but icons can also be much, much bigger or quite small as well. All right. I think there was one more thing I was going to say. Oh, icon covers. We can maybe talk more about that later. So, what is an icon? The word icon in English just comes from the Greek word icon in Greek, meaning image in its most basic sense. This was a word that was used before Christianity emerged in the ancient world. And so, in a sense, means just any kind of image. It's the word in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, when God created humanity in God's image and likeness, icon would be the word that's used there. In the Christian tradition and in art historical, for art historians, the word icon has come to mean often a panel painting, a kind of a holy portrait, a painting of a saint or biblical figure or something like that. I'll hope to explain or give some background in terms of how these relate to presence. So we'll say more about that, but for right now, I say, something I often tell students is that an icon, when you think of like the icon on your computer screen, we call those icons as well, don't we? And it's not your document, but you click on it and it takes you to your document. This is a very crude analogy. But an icon, a holy portrait, that's not Saint Stephen. I know that. I know, to your point, like, we're not worshiping the icons. We know, in the ancient world, you see sometimes some confusion, and not just in Christian context, but in Roman pagan context about, is the deity inhabiting, to what degree is the deity inhabiting, in that context, usually a statue of the deity, but, so there are some of those historical questions, and you see that in the anxiety in the early church and conversations about images. But we could say that these icons or images are not the thing themselves, but rather, and this is the language of the early church, they participate in the prototype. So as you pointed out, sir, that when I kiss or bow before an icon, I'm not worshiping the wood and the paint, but I'm showing respect. And in fact, as the next term here.
I wonder if I could just make a quick comment.
Go ahead.
I think throughout Christendom, we can get aligned with the item or the thing as opposed to what it points to. So I thought we both agreed that we thought that was a great example when you talked about the computer icon, because it points us. The cross, Scripture, can become an entity unto themselves as opposed to what it's supposed to be pointing us to.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a great point. Should I stand to the side, or is this location okay? Okay, I don't want to block anything. Yes, and to that point, the question of what an idol is one that's been heavily, kind of engaged by Christian theologians and practitioners throughout history. And I think in the Protestant Reformation, it was often lobbed at, the images and objects associated with Catholic devotion, so literal images. But it's true that an idol can be anything. It's, venerating something, or not venerating, but worshiping something that's not God, right? And kind of raising something up above God, we'd say. Okay, so, my other terms. Two important terms here. I'm gonna have to go like this so that I can see what I wrote. Want to make a distinction between veneration and worship. So I'm giving you it in the Greek and in the Latin. Proskinesis and dulia mean the same thing, more or less, but this is prostration, the physical act of prostration, which is an expression of veneration, and is different. So worship belongs to God alone. Veneration we can also think of as honoring. So you might have a photo of a deceased loved one that you put in a place of honor in your home, on the mantle by your bedside, right? Worship is something that only belongs to God. Now, historically, how do we tell the difference between whether someone's worshiping something and venerating something? Of course, it's very difficult because this is kind of an internal process. So, but again, we engage in these things. We'll come back to some of this terminology if I manage my time well enough. But I'm going to try to do a very brief summary of origins of Christian art and some of the issues of how do we even categorize something as Christian art. What I'm showing you is arguably one of the earliest depictions of Jesus. It's not a friendly depiction. It's a depiction of Jesus with a donkey's head being crucified. And this was found in a, basically like the equivalent of like a boys' locker room in ancient Rome. And it says, Alexamemnos worships his God, right? So this is a kind of anti-Christian image. Some of the other earliest images we have are these two intaglio gems. So you can see they're engravings. It's very simple. In one, we have a single figure of a crucified person, very, very stylized. The one on the left-hand side, which also has a bunch of names listed there. And this includes the name of Jesus, but also other deities, some Egyptian deities and things like that. So it seems like this person is kind of hedging their bets, and just kind of including Jesus and having this image along with these other deities. And indeed, in the ancient world, just like today, people had multiple religious belonging, and the religious practice on the ground was very different than maybe what theologians or church authorities might endorse, right? People do what's meaningful to them. The other intaglio, so the question is, to what degree would we call this a Christian image? We don't know if the person who commissioned it identified as a Christian or what. The other image is more explicitly Christian in that you again have that same crucified figure, this time flanked by 6 figures on either side. So we could take these to be the disciples, right? So we might call this a Christian image. But it's small. It's something that would be worn on the body. We don't have the earliest surviving kind of large-scale Christian art dates to the late 2nd, early 3rd century. And it's funerary in context. I have more of those. Here we go. The catacombs in Rome. If you're claustrophobic, don't go. But these, even before the legalization of Christianity, the Christian community in Rome was given property in which to bury their dead, and this is where we find some of the earliest Christian images. Let's see. I'll try and limit. I'm going to say here. One of the questions would be, why this delay, right? The Christian church is forming in the 1st century. Its major texts are being written in the 1st century CE. The New Testament text, but then also the kind of apostolic texts in the 1st and 2nd century. And yet we don't have Christian images that survive until the late 2nd, early 3rd century. Why this delay? One answer is, or what was narrated by mostly Protestant art historians in the 20th century was that the early Christian community, they weren't idolaters like the Catholics. They were a pure community. I mean, if you read the text, they had lots of problems, so it's not like things were going great. But there's this narrative of like, with Constantine, the Christian church, Christianity gets legalized, it becomes associated with empire, therefore becomes corrupt. Jesus goes from being a good shepherd to this enthroned emperor, and this kind of thing. I have a whole book where I try and challenge that on the Good Shepherd, and I actually argue that the Good Shepherd is a kind of imperial image, actually. That's a whole nother story, too. Way impossible to summarize in 2 minutes. But other factors that I think are important to consider, the early church was a persecuted church. So when you are a persecuted religious minority, you're, it's not a priority for you to commission large-scale artwork. When they did start commissioning large-scale artwork, as we see in the catacombs, some of it is, actually most of the images are stories from the Hebrew Bible. Some of them are, of course, New Testament scenes, Jesus performing miracles and healing people, which in a funerary context makes a lot of sense. A lot of images that reference, that we also find in baptismal art. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for example, or Moses striking the rock and water coming out, Jonah and the sea creature, those kinds of things. So a lot of images from the Hebrew Bible, but the other thing is that when they do begin to commission artwork, they're commissioning it from whom? From existing Roman workshops, which means that, and I compare this is maybe not a good metaphor for you all, I don't know how many people have tattoos here, but when you go into a tattoo shop and there's like those big things on the wall that you can pick from, or a book that you could pick from, it's like this when you go into a Roman workshop, right? There are some standard motifs. In the Mediterranean world, grapes and vines, great. For a Roman, this might reference Dionysius. For a Christian, the Eucharist, right? So there's a flexibility, and this is the thing about the great power of images that the early Christian community used quite strategically because they could communicate rich theological kind of claims or beliefs and do it in a covert way. Okay, we better get going. A thing I'll say here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are on the right-hand side there. So this is this image of salvation from, a great leap of faith and salvation from death, And you can see the slabs underneath there where the bodies would be entombed. This comes too also to the origins of icons, where we have in the early church and in Rome, the early Christian persecution was sporadic but intense. And there were a few, right before Constantine legalized Christianity, there were a couple of bouts, in the late third century and 4th century that were actually targeted, and Christians, scriptures were destroyed and people were executed, and you had to have a receipt that showed that you had, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you were supposed to have a receipt that showed that you had made an offering to the cult of the emperor, right? And if you didn't, you were subject to persecution. So we have early Christian martyrs. Their bodies are entombed. Perhaps their portraits are painted nearby, or an epitaph with their name. And so early on, and I think this is part of the inheritance of icons, is that there's this idea of, there's a reality of presence. There's a bodily, physical presence in proximity to sacred images. This is quite literal in the early church, in the catacombs. The early Christian community might come to that person's gravesite on the anniversary of their death and remember them. They might light a lamp or hang a wreath, and this is something that early Christian leadership, church leadership, wrote against because it was too much like what the pagans were doing. So the concern isn't with images and what we see in these early Christian texts, but that they are trying to distinguish themselves from their pagan contemporaries. We're not doing what they're doing. And that's why also early Christian altars are wooden tables and not stone. Over time, once they've, the tables have turned and paganism gets persecuted and eventually outlawed, then they go back to stone altars. If that makes sense. Okay, so presence, physical presence. Another thing I'd say why that's important is that the martyrs were understood to be kind of the special friends of God. They had died for their faith in the way that Jesus had, and so therefore there's an understanding that holiness is sticky. I don't know how else to say it, that there's something about them and their bodies that even after death is associated with that kind of sacrificial love and holiness. Okay, I'll keep going there. I felt like there was one more thing I was going to say. Pointing the wrong way. So we start to see in the catacombs, in addition to depictions of biblical stories, also what we would call kind of iconic compositions. So these frontal-facing portraits, it's not narrative. It's presenting a figure. Here we see a woman in an orans pose or praying pose. And so because they're not telling a story, there is this, as the icons that are on the tables here, invite a relationship, like you have. They invite that you're looking at them. Well, with them too is a nice way of putting it, actually. So this one is probably an early image of Mary. She has her hands up like this and an infant on her lap. There's the Cairo to her right, which is a Greek abbreviation for the first two letters of Christ. So makes sense this is likely Mary. There's some difficulty with identification in the catacombs with some motifs, so, but they've held up very well for almost 2,000 years. Here's also another possibly very early image of Mary, which I'm going to move on from for the sake of time. Here's an example of the issue of identification. Because in the ancient world, of course, a mother and an infant, or a mother breastfeeding, or a mother with a kind of sacred son is not a new concept. And so you have Isis and Horus in Egypt, for example, and there are these other non-Christian kind of sacred mother figures. So one of the critiques that comes in the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy, which we'll talk about in a minute, is if it's not labeled, then how do you know you're venerating the right deity, right? And this is perceived as by the iconoclast or anti-image position, kind of this challenge to that. We also have, this is one of the earliest kind of iconic, we might say iconic images of Jesus, which is frontal facing. We have the Alpha and Omega and a halo there on the ceiling of this catacomb. A thing to say about this too, let me see. We don't have any of the governments there, but so here he's depicted bearded. In the catacombs, he's often depicted beardless, actually, clean-shaven, and looking very Roman, has a toga, and is doing, performing miracles. There's a really important site in Syria called Dura Europos, a 3rd century Roman outpost. And Yale University has a great online gallery of their stuff because they were the excavators of the site in the early 20th century. And it has the earliest surviving Christian baptistry, mid-3rd century, that has images all over in it that survived. And also a synagogue was in the same city that was covered floor to ceiling in images. And it really changed art historians' understandings because one of those assumptions was, well, the early Christian community didn't have images because the Jews didn't have images. And that's not true. The Jewish community has been having and creating incredible artwork for thousands of years. And that synagogue demonstrates it, where there were scenes. There's not images of God. There will be images of the hand of God, which is the equivalent of like a speech bubble in images. It kind of is like a hey you and represents speech from the biblical stories. But it really showed that there's, really robust visual thinking that's happening at this time. Okay. Oh yeah. Go ahead.
Do we know why he's depicted more as a Roman in as opposed to how we typically think about with more Jewish?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's actually why I mentioned the Dura Europos site, because in the synagogue, Moses is depicted in a Roman toga, and Moses is also depicted clean-shaven in that image. So, and they look kind of like, in fresco, it's very gestural and kind of loose, so they look kind of like vaguely, Mediterranean, you'd say. But what's important about that, and thank you for helping me complete my thought, is that they're representing these biblical stories in the culture of their time. They are in a Roman outpost. Like this is the dress and this is the style, but that the frescoes in Dura Europos also have representations of the temple, which at that point had been destroyed, for almost 200 years, but is still a really important part of, obviously, the community's religious memory and imagination. So there's a way that they're both like kind of importing biblical stories into their contemporary moment, and also even the temple itself, right? Yeah, it's a good question. Really briefly, you might say there's kind of two categories of texts as we move into the development of what we can kind of properly call icons or religious icons. And we start to have stories of religiously, in the 4th century on, of stories that were miraculously created. One of the most famous of these stories is called the Mandylion of Edessa, where King Abgar of Edessa was sick with leprosy and wrote to Jesus hoping for healing, and instead Jesus impressed his face on a cloth and sent that kind of in his stead, and this image healed the king. So that's seen as an endorsement of images, and that's a story that, this is from a detail from a 10th century icon that represents the story. The story is meant to have happened in the 1st century. I think the first written recording is in the 4th century. This is common, that kind of tradition, we'll say. Yeah. But those kinds of stories are understood as a divine endorsement, or used to argue for a divine endorsement of sacred images. And these images often tend to replicate themselves. So there's this story of, I think, a woman who found a miraculous image of Jesus in a well and put it in her cloak and went home, and it had duplicated itself in her cloak, right? So there's something where the kind of generativity of the sacred. The other category, of course, is images made by people, a much bigger category. And these are images that in the early church are used to teach biblical stories, and there's this idea of presence or relationship, we might say, which Pastor Patrick's sermon this morning was really perfect. I don't know, I should thank him for talking so much about presence, because that's really what I want to share with you this morning. Yeah, it was great. So they might honor someone, something that's memorial. A thing to say about images that teach, though, is that images, they're sometimes referred to as like books for the illiterate. But if you look at an image of Noah in the catacombs, it's just a guy in a box with a bird flowing like over his head. You're not going to get the whole story of Noah's Ark from that image. Many of these images rely on or depend on a certain level of knowledge of biblical stories, so that someone might recognize them, and then maybe that's an invitation to meditate on that idea, or that there's somebody there preaching or teaching or sharing the background and then might use that image to share that, right? So images and text are different in significant ways. So by the end of the 4th century, we know that Christian images are ubiquitous. There's some regional councils that are commenting on them and are kind of expressing some concerns, but it shows that they're being used in worship. Pope Gregory the Great famously had a letter correspondence about images, and I won't go down that rabbit hole, but that's kind of where that images as books for the illiterate comes from, is from one of his letters. By the late 6th century, there are stories of images that are miraculously protective, have been created miraculously. And icons at this time, this is a 6th century icon that's at St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. It's made in encaustic, which is wax mixed with pigment. So this is before the invention of oil painting, but it has a very similar kind of quality to that, in that light can kind of enter into the medium and it has a really nice warmth to it. Yeah.
What is the significance of the illumination? And when did that start from the
I think it's down here.
beginning?
The illumination, you mean the use of gold?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I know that gold is being used by the 6th century, definitely. I'm sure earlier than that.
But where did they get the gold?
The gold?
That was expensive.
It is
and-
expensive, yeah. Yeah, they're using, I mean, it's gold leaf, so it's very,
Yeah.
very, very thin.
Right.
And can also be mixed with pigment, so it can be, so you can either use it as gold leaf or as paint in a kind of like more diffuse way. And you'll see too, and as I was trying to think of a date there, what came to mind for me was like the mosaics in Santa Maria Maggiore, which is 5th century, where they're also using gold and other precious, mother of pearl or things like this that will glimmer in the light of the space. So the reason for using gold is, of course, and it is costly, but that's showing this kind of, dedication and honor, sacrifice kind of, and using resources like that. And gold, understood to have kind of the spiritual quality. So it represents, you'll see icons and like St. Stephen there, who has just a gold background, is a way of showing that kind of signaling that spiritual space. And I'd say that, halos, for example, were used in religious art before Christianity. And it goes back in Buddhism, you see it. In ancient Egyptian art, you find some kind of versions of auras, and then also in so-called pagan, Roman art. And those aren't even adopted initially in earliest images of Jesus. So I'm thinking of like, gold already had a spiritual association in the Greco-Roman world, I guess is what I'm getting to there. Yeah. Did you have a?
I was wondering about the halo with around the head. That's representing a halo.
Yeah, and that's a halo. And Jesus is usually has, it's called a cruciform halo or a cross-inscribed halo. And so it's very easy to pick him out of a crowd. And sometimes we'll have the Alpha and Omega in it, or other, titles, things like that. Yeah. So things shift. This is a major. Here we go. Sorry, one more thing about this. I'm including on either side of this image what are known as the Feum funerary portraits, and these are some of the most incredible painting that I think exists in human history. These are funeral portraits that were created in, I suppose, 1st to the 3rd century. I don't have the dates in front of me. CE in Egypt. And these are also encaustic in medium, so it's wax mixed with pigment. And they're incredibly lively portraits. The Met Museum in New York City has a great collection. I think the Cleveland Art Museum has a good collection too. But they're so, and I hate to use the word modern as a compliment. As a medievalist, I'm like opposed to that. But they are so modern in a lot of ways. Like they're very intimate, they're very personal, and you really get the sense of the person that they represent. And so these are panels that would then be attached to the mummy, you know, to the wrapped body right over their face. And then they would be encased in their various sarcophagi. So this is another kind of reference, I think, or something that's kind of in the water in terms of that funerary portraiture presence and then iconic or icon panel painting.
And that's on a material that was attached to the
Yeah.
amazing to survive.
Yeah, so on the right-hand side, you can see the panel shape, and then the, stage right, so, sorry, I flipped around for you. The right-hand side for you shows the panel wrapped around there, yeah. They're great, love them. So things change in the 7th century pretty dramatically, and I'm going to try to move quickly here so I can say a little bit more about worship. But basically, with the emergence of Islam in the East, the Byzantine Empire quickly loses 2/3 of its territories, and so you have large Christian populations living under Muslim rule, actually largely very peacefully. And I can say a lot more about that, but I'll try to stay focused on the image aspect, which is that there becomes an anxiety in Christianity, a theological anxiety about images and theology, because you see this this new monotheistic religion that is aniconic or resistant to images in many ways, or at least images of people, with experiencing great military success and lots of conversions and things like that. And so this is arguably one of the things that institutes or triggers what's known as the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy. And this is a debate about images in the 8th century in the Eastern Roman Empire. So there's both an anxiety about images, and then images become more powerful in this period in the stories that are shared. So there's a story where Constantinople is under siege, and they process an image of the Virgin Mary around it, and they're miraculously saved, right? So it's kind of like images in a time where the Christian community needs more spiritual help. Images are understood to be one expression of that, or one tool in that spiritual help. But then there's also regulation and concern about images at the same time that they're getting that power. So we have an ecumenical council, the Council in Trullo, in the late 7th century, that kind of doesn't forbid images, but makes some, forbids the sign of the cross being on the floor. You shouldn't walk on the sign of the cross. That Jesus should only be depicted in human form and not as a lamb, because Jesus came as a human. So we talk about him as a lamb, but we should represent him as a human. Those kinds of things. So there's a lot of positive references to images by the end of the 7th century, including, using candles and incense and so on. And I think, we don't have time to talk about him, I'm sorry. Jesus, we don't have time to talk about him. You talked about it, yeah, he's had his time. We can talk about some other folks. This, and I'll have to do this thing here so I can see what I'm looking at. I'll share my slides. I've already shared my slides with Sarah and Matthew. So you could also return to these if you want. So I'll try to go through this a little bit more quickly to get to my kind of conclusion. But in essence, the iconoclastic controversy in Byzantium is a bit of a misnomer, because there's actually very little evidence that any images were destroyed. Whereas in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, we know that many, many images were destroyed. There's lots of documentation, and if you travel in Europe, you can still see images on churches that were destroyed during the Reformation. Or the French Revolution, that's the other one where a lot of images were destroyed. Instead, the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy is better talked about as a theological debate. And there were political elements, and Leslie Brubaker has a wonderful book that kind of unpacks everything that's at stake in this controversy. But I thought I'd give you a sense of this question of like why images or why not images, right? So the iconoclasts, we don't have a lot of documents because they lost the fight in the East, but there are a couple of councils, and so we have those texts. And then also some of the winning side, like Theodore the Studite and John of Damascus, in their texts they present debates with iconoclasts, and so we get that position represented, how, take it with a grain of salt, on the other side. Obviously, they reference the second commandment, so you shall have no images, right, or no false idols, that kind of thing. Now, there's a question of how the commandments get numbered, because of course they're not actually numbered in the biblical text, right? God didn't say, okay, number 1, number 2. So there's different traditions in different Christian communities of the numbering of the commandments. And the second commandment can arguably be grouped with the first one, and as an understanding of an extension of, you shall have no other God, right? So maybe, and one interpretation is, an idol is an image of somebody else's God, right? So this is the thing that the tradition debates. They point to lots of stories from the Hebrew Bible. So Moses heard God but didn't get to see God. They argue for the superiority of spirit over matter, this question of whether images relate to the original and in what sense. And they say that an icon has to share some kind of substance. So the only real icon is the Eucharist, is communion. That's the only thing that shares in the substance with the divine. So they're really trying to protect the divinity of Jesus and to avoid idolatry. Whereas the pro-image folks, their main argument, and it's the real mic drop moment, is the incarnation of Jesus. They say, God became human, dwelt among us, was material, and so therefore it's not just permissible to make images of Jesus, but we are theologically compelled to make images of Jesus, because to reject images of Jesus is to reject the incarnation, and that is a problem for a Christian. So they're arguing that it's absolutely necessary to affirm the reality of the incarnation through making images of Jesus. And then they point to all these stories in the Hebrew Bible where God instructs creation of various types of images and buildings. They clarify, the veneration, as we talked about earlier, goes to the prototype, not to the image itself. And then they say, no icon shares a substance with its thing. You almost hear them say, like, listen, dummies, like, that's the whole point of an icon, is that it's not actually sharing substance, but it's directing you to that thing, right? So as with a lot of theological issues, there's questions about terminology. And that's why, like Dr. Sarah, you go to graduate school, I suppose. This is a really great quote that I'll maybe not go through. I don't know. How are you feeling? Are you doing okay? This is like a lot of information. You're okay? Okay, all right. Well, then we can read it because it's one of my favorites. So this is from Theodore the Studite. And he's pushing back on this issue of like, how do we relate to material? So I'll just read it if you don't mind. He says, I do not worship matter. I worship the God of matter, who became matter for my sake and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter, that is, through the incarnation. I will not cease from honoring that matter which works out my salvation. I venerate it, though not as God. How could God be born out of lifeless things? I honor all matter and venerate it. Through it, filled as it were with a divine power and grace, my salvation has come to me. Was the 3 times happy and blessed wood of the cross not matter? Was the sacred and holy mountain of Calvary not matter? What of the life-giving rock, the holy tomb, the source of our resurrection? Was it not matter? Is the holy book of the Gospels not matter? Is the blessed table which gives us the bread of life not matter? Are the gold and silver out of which crosses and altar plate and chalices are made not matter? And therefore, all these things, and before all these things, is not the body and blood of our Lord matter? Either stop venerating all these things, or submit to the tradition of the church in the venerating of images, honoring God and his friends, and following in this the grace of the Holy Spirit. Do not despise matter, for it is not despicable. Nothing that God has made is. So this is a very strongly worded, and you can see, the rhetorical structure, matter. He's emphasizing this again and again. To say that our salvation was, sure, the goal is union with the divine, but we are bodies, and our salvation is worked out in the world through the person of Jesus and through creation, which is good, right? And so he's saying icons are part of that creation, right? Okay. This is my little moving towards concluding to talk about what this looks like in practice a little bit. And then we can certainly have more conversation and questions as much as you want. So this image struggle eventually was concluded in the mid-9th century, and really it resulted in a kind of like codifying of the use of images. Rather than challenging them, ultimately it ensured that images were central to Christian worship in the East. So in terms of the tradition of different schools of iconography is very rich and long, and I can't possibly even barely gesture to it here. But what I'll say about process is that even the process is theological, and I would recommend, if you're interested, the Prosopone School in New York City. So prosopone, like the Greek word for face. Is that right? I'm Latin, not Greek. I'm Latin, not Greek, so okay. But they have great resources online, and you can watch videos of where they kind of narrate the process of creating an icon and the theology that's associated with it. And they come to the Twin Cities, actually. They do a iconography school at St. Mary's, I think it's at St. Mary's Cathedral every fall. And it's a week-long, it's quite intense, it's a week-long, 8-hour kind of day, but would highly recommend if you're interested. I've actually never done it. I've known people who have. I'm going to be on sabbatical in the fall, so I'm planning on taking the class, and I'm very excited. Yeah. But you can see here in the image behind me that they actually build up with darker colors first, and then add, and they're using an egg tempera, and mixing pigments themselves and things like that. So it builds up, and of course the theological association with that is one of enlightenment. And here that's my church, but here we go, sorry, I thought I was at this one. So the red ground that you see there is the medium that the gold leaf is adhered to. And so the red ground there is like a clay-like substance. And when the illuminator, the way that they attach the gold leaf is to blow on it, much like God enlivened Adam, yes, and then apply the gold leaf, right? So even a little act like that is understood to have theological significance. And an iconographer, in theory, should maintain, a devotional life, a prayer life. It's understood as a theological endeavor that you're engaging in, and so you shouldn't take into that lightly, right? So it's usually why there's apprenticeship models and things like this. But this is a ministry to the church to paint these. So here's my little church in St. Paul. You're welcome to join. We've been there for over 125 years. Where are we at now? 130 years, something like that. So it's a historically Russian and Ukrainian community. And you can see our iconostasis here. So some of you have been in Orthodox churches before, but it's floor to ceiling in images. And how old are those? These are not very old. They were painted in the last 30 years. Yeah, and so for this space. So you can see, sorry, here. So here's the iconostasis, which means icon stand. These are the royal doors where the priests and deacons come through here at specific times. There's also deacon doors, one here and one here, which usually have the angels, the archangels on them. And so because angels are messengers and deacons are kind of the messengers of the church, they go in and out there like those clocks, where people go at the door. This one, our church is a little different because we have an icon of the who's known as the good thief on the other door, because he said, surely, this is the Son of God. But it's common, we come into church, you'll see there's no chairs. We have benches around the edge, but generally people stand through the whole service. It's okay if you need to sit, lots of people sit. And we come and greet our main icon. So here, when it's not a feast day, it'll be of Holy Trinity, which is my church. So we have Holy Trinity here, and then you'll go up and venerate the icon of Jesus and of Mary. I'm in the choir, so I go over there. But the way that we venerate icons is by crossing ourselves and then kissing them. And you can see I think I have another. Oh, this is from above. So this is from the choir loft. We don't use it as a choir loft anymore, but and you can get a better sense of also the kind of dome of the building. Yep, that's right. The choir to the right. It's very organic. Everybody kind of children feel very comfortable in our space because there's rugs on the floor and they just kind of, run around during church. It feels very much like it's theirs, which I quite like. But people might come up and light a candle as the service is going. As long as the gospel is not being read and it's not the sermon, you can kind of move around as you need. Really great for folks with ADHD, I would say. Quite literally, it really is. Let's see, my pointer. So someone asked me earlier about just these size icons. So mostly these are full icons, but there are right over here, there's also little icons hanging in some parts between the windows. So we have both of those, and at the back of the church are also some of those.
Is this Greek Orthodox?
We're OCA, so that's Orthodox Church of America, and it was historically associated with the Russian Orthodox Church, but has been autocephalous, self-ruling for some time.
And you said you stand during the service.
Yeah,
As traditional in Bulgarian Orthodox, that's what it is. Very few seats.
yep,
The seats are only for the elderly.
Yep.
Everybody else stands.
yep,
And the difference in the Orthodox tradition is it's corporate worship
that's right.
versus individual worship in our tradition.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's very much, it's corporate in two senses. Corporate, really corporate, very embodied. So, you walk into church, you cross yourself, we cross ourselves like this for the Trinity and then the two natures of Christ. And you might do a cross like this, or you might do a full prostration. There's certain times where, especially during Lent, where we'll do a full body prostration and kneel down on the ground. But we're also lighting candles, incense is used. So, for example, there's several parts of the service where the deacon will come out and with a censer go all around the church, sensing the space, which, the Psalms associate incense with prayer. This is an ancient association, so may our prayers arise like incense. And it smells good, But the deacon will also sense the congregation because, of course, we're also icons of God, right? And so I think that's a very powerful thing. So yeah, it's multi-sensory and embodied in that way. And kissing and bowing and lighting and singing. And our whole liturgy is sung, really. The only spoken part of the liturgy is the sermon. And then when we say maybe the Our Father and the Creed. Those are the only things we speak. But everything else, all the prayers are chanted. And but then it's, to your point, also corporal in the sense, or corporate in the sense that it's something that's all done together. I always kind of remark how I like that the community tells the priest what to do. So liturgically speaking.
That happens in our church.
Yeah, it's like.
It was an obvious joke.
That's good. You can't let that go by without saying something. Yeah, it's a timeless. The tale is old as time. Yeah, but liturgically speaking, the church the choir will chant "Father bless," and then the priest gives the sermon. There's this back and forth, liturgical, antiphonal, really, relationship that happens liturgically.
Are you
Yeah.
doing also chants?
Mhm.
There's such a deep. I'm blessed when I hear Orthodox chants. And
Me too.
It's such a rich tradition. It's just, if you haven't experienced it, it's just profound.
Yeah. So there's no instruments. It's all just voice, human voice, and it's an 8-tone system. So every week is a different tone, and so you'll have even the same text but different musical settings.
And typically only male voices, not.
Maybe historically, I think that for that it depends on your tradition. In the United States, you'll have both, and there's places. Yeah, Russia, certainly. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I think it depends on your tradition for that, yeah. There was something else I was going to say there. Chanting, I don't know. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, because we're really over time. I'll say something about this icon, which sorry, did you have a question?
I was just gonna say, I've been in Greece, but if you haven't been to St. Mary's Greek or
Oh, yeah.
church here over by Lake Harriet, that's a very good place to see some beautiful examples of Greek icons.
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
I've been to that church on their Easter. I had been in Greece.
Did you go to the
during
midnight
Holy
one?
Week, the year, and then I've had friends who are members, in fact, one of those people is a member of this church. I went to their Easter Sunday, which is usually after our
Yep, yeah.
Easter. And it was just so moving to me because I had just been in Athens. But there's some beautiful examples of Greek icons.
Yeah, yeah, they're a great community. And I realized the thing I was going to say was about the tonal system, which is that I was in Croatia one time and kind of wandered into an Orthodox church. And of course, I don't speak the language, but because of the music, I knew where we were in the liturgy, and so I just sang in English to myself, because everything I could kind of jump right in. So there's it's interesting because there's a kind of universality through music.
I was privileged to be a part of the Easter service, midnight Easter service in Sofia, Bulgaria,
Yeah, wow.
at the large cathedral right in the center. Interesting, built by the Russians. But it was almost a theatrical event.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah,
If you wanted a seat, you had to be there from 10 o'clock. If you wanted to not a seat,
be in there, yeah,
proximity to
yeah,
what's going on. And we were fortunate to be right up in the front.
Yeah.
And to watch the people wanting to grab the candle that was held by the head.
oh, the priest, oh yeah, sure,
And this was the flame of the spirit. And everybody was trying to light their candle off.
from that one, yeah.
And the bishop.
He's just trying to get through the thing,
Really quite interesting.
yeah,
But a deep reverence there, and it's just looking around, at how touched people were.
yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, I'll just say about this icon that this is, we have some Ukrainian folks in our congregation, one of whom, Paul Gavrilyuk, who teaches at the University of St. Thomas, and he's from Ukraine, and he's created a foundation called Rebuild Ukraine that's bringing especially tourniquets to Ukraine, but lots of other resources. And our church, because of our support of this organization, was gifted this icon on the left, which was made from an ammunition box, the lid of an ammunition box. And so it's all dinged up and things like that. And then someone painted an icon of Paul on it for us. It's
Well,
amazing. Yeah.
And you're only trying to describe thousands of years,
Yeah,
so
so
the fact
sorry,
that
sorry,
the fact you
speaking to
didn't
whatever.
nail it to the 100%, but
Thank
you obviously brought you've expanded our minds and thoughts about things that we recognize and see and understand. And there is that mixture of theology that has been plaguing the church for a long time on a number of subjects, but certainly in terms of this. But those who have had an experience or seen the reverence that folks who use them as a way to draw them closer, it's unmistakable. And I think it's just like anything, right? They can become graven images. They can be if we're using them for the wrong reason. But if they remind us to point us towards the relationship that God desires for us, I mean, they're just beautiful, beautiful symbols and beautiful expressions of creation. So the couple that just left, Cliff, he creates icons all the time. As a matter of fact, when I get done preaching, he'll oftentimes put in a mailbox an icon of the image that he saw in his mind. So it's still happening in the life of the church. So you are fascinating, and we'll have to have you come back and continue the story with us. So right, yeah. Well, What a great way for us to end the year with adult ed on Sunday mornings. What a great way for us to think about the ways that we approach our relationship with God. So you help expand that. So let's just close with a word of prayer. God, thanks for the chance to be here on a Sunday morning. And thanks for the gifts that you've given Dr. Freeman and the ways that she has expanded our understanding of the ways that you continue to draw us closer to you. Thank you for the ways that you use gifts and abilities and talents of humans to draw us to the sacred. So God, bless her work and her sabbatical, and bless her time with us this day, and bless this folks that have gathered. We love you. We seek to follow you, and we're grateful for your presence in our lives. We pray this in your name. Amen. All right, you have the rest of the day off.
Where is your church?
It's on Forest Street in St. Paul.